So I think the first I'll cover W.C. Handy, a first musician on the timeline, just because he gets into his career kind of covers a pretty long span and kind of gets into some of the other terminology that we'll talk to on the timeline. Um, yeah. Okay. So W.C. Handy is an interesting individual because he was a well-trained musician, um, and he liked to refer to himself as the father of the blues, which is pretty controversial, but also I think also not it's not heavily disputed because even W.C. Handy, was somebody who kind of said it, but to some degree knew like that was not maybe the case. But what he did do is he was the first individual to commercially record, to write and compose the song and to commercially record that song. Um, Blues track, and in music history is the first one to commercially record a blues track. It was called the Memphis Blues. Um, and as I kind of noted briefly in the intro episode, that this sound was not necessarily a sound that you associate with the blues. He had a pretty big backing in ragtime and some of the other sounds that preceded um, the blues, as far as like hymns, spirituals, ragtime. He did play jazz later on down the line, which of course ragtime, um, with blues influences, kind of is what eventually became the jazz. So it he also contributed to that, and it kind of makes sense his due to his sound because he was a well trained musician. He didn't necessarily ever consider himself specifically a blues person. He really saw the potential commercial appeal. He became interested in it, and then along with some other musicians, tried to record that and add that into the commercial popular music scene, which eventually did. He did not have the first blues hit, but he's the one who put it out there. Put it out to the world commercially. People would hear it and become a little bit more interested in it, and kind of spread that initial popularity to the commercial music scene. And even though it doesn't sound like a blues track, like when you hear it, you definitely will be like, this, sounds a little bit like kind of like ragtime. Is what I keep saying, but I feel like it that describes it pretty well, and it fits his other repertoire pretty well, and even more so than some of the other early blues songs that you might hear, just because of his background. But it does follow a 12-bar structure, which is a pretty basic blues structure. So at the end of the day, it's a blues track. But the key is like when he recorded it, the blues had already been around. He's not the creator of the blues at all, but it was just not in the spotlight or the focus of the commercial music industry or really pop culture at all. Blues was very much, stemming from former slaves, former or current sharecroppers. A blue collar. It was definitely a very blue collar music, black blue collar music, stemming from the hardships and oppression, and it was really an outlet, and you could really hear that sort of grit, the grind, like people overcoming different struggles and hardships, and the musical portion was definitely a little bit rudimentary and simple in the beginning, very heavily guitar use, because that was one instrument that people were able to get their hands on at the time, and so a lot of early blues was structured on the guitar, which we'll talk about later. And I think I mentioned this before, but the guitar at the time was not really was not a performance instrument. It was an acoustic guitar, especially during those times. It was obviously the sound projection is limited, so you can perform. Remember this is before you really had a whole lot of amplifying ability. So you really wanted people who could naturally belt, um, a cappella, I guess you could say, uh, and have instruments that also could project. And the guitar is just not necessarily that type of instrument. An acoustic guitar, if you've been to any kind of concert, usually has some sort of additional a microphone or acoustic electrics. Now you can play and it'll project through a speaker. So at that time, that it's limited. It's kind of a solo instrument, and that's how the blues were kind of crafted. And it was kind of good timing because shortly later, as we'll talk about, electric amplification, electric recording, electric guitar, all this kind of came into play, and that really allowed, some of these blues players to take their song to the next level. But in the meantime, we had these other well-trained musicians like W.C. Handy, who really started off, who could play a bunch of instruments, not necessarily focused on the blues, but was able to hear it. He was a black man. He was going to frequent. He's going to have some ties to black community. He's going to frequent areas that there might be a black establishment, something that white musicians are probably not less likely to do. I'll say that. And so he had that exposure. I think in the previous episode I mentioned the first time he came upon it, he mentioned that this man was playing, and I didn't specify a location because that's another thing, to come upon a black musician playing the blues. Black people were not able to play in mainstream venues. A lot of bars or places where you would play, especially during those times, it wouldn't be uncommon to see someone playing out in the square or playing maybe in some sort of black establishment. Even the black church, the blues was not it was a outsider music. It was a rebel music. It was not seen as something. It was seen as a genre that was kind of, like I said, a little rough and gritty, but even more so to some people, it was kind of seen as music for low lives. It was a little bit of an underground genre, I guess. Probably one of the original American underground genres, actually. And so you're not going to necessarily see this in places you frequent, in other words. But as a black man, you're going to have a higher occurrence of encountering another black musician, just because you got everything segregated. You're very limited into where you can go and where you can perform, what you can do. And so that was, I think, one of the reasons that W.C. Handy was able to be exposed to that and add that to his music repertoire and bring that to the commercial